Okay. Good afternoon, Joel. How are you doing from lovely Edmonton?
I'm doing well. The rain is coming in, but it's honestly it's been a beautiful summer up here. Um,
Yeah.
how are you down in Calgary?
Good. Yeah. It was like the sky looks pretty ominous right now. It was looking like we were going to have a little bit of rain come in, but looks like the sun's shining now. It's been so wet. And I don't know how many women are watching this, but Alberta and Calgary in particular are just so good for hair for women. Like you give yourself a blowout and your hair stays. It's been so rainy. I'm just like, this is like my number one concern with the rain. So anyway,
I
those are
can't
first
say
world
I lived
problems.
through that myself, but I have my own concerns. None of them have to do with hair.
Yeah.
Um, knock on wood. But
Yeah.
it's been it's been a minute since we last chatted, actually,
It
and it
has.
feels
Yeah.
it feels like every time I don't talk to you, I lose a grip on the kind of the position that Canada is in politically, and it bothers me because it's you can watch CBC, you can watch CTV, you can watch pretty much every wire, and all of them are talking about American politics.
Yeah.
We get
Yeah.
nothing up here, and if we do get something
Yeah.
up here, it doesn't seem to me like it is bipartisan.
Yeah.
So I find it challenging to find kind of where we're at. And interestingly, before we jumped on, you wrote this phenomenal email that I loved, and I'm gonna touch on it after we discuss kind of what we're meant to talk about. But without your newsletter, I don't know what I would do from a political perspective. So I appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun with it. It's like, I think you're not alone. I think everybody feels like there's so much going on and it's really hard to keep up with what's going on. And I think that 2025 in particular has been a really busy year for sure. So yeah, I think probably a good place to start would just be to level set a little bit, as you say, on what's going on politically in Canada, and as it relates to some of the tariff decisions and back and forth, because I know that's what's keeping, at least for all of my clients and the people that I talk to, that's really keeping people up at night because of all the uncertainty that it's breeding. So I guess what I would say is that the last time we chatted, I think Carney had just formed a majority government with the Liberals after the April 28th federal election in Canada, or 45th federal election. He was bringing his cabinet together. He was sort of laying the groundwork. The G7 was on the horizon, and there were definitely ongoing tariff disputes happening at that time between Canada and the United States. In fact, Carney did announce some retaliatory tariffs during the writ period, during the election with the US. So that was sort of like a thing that was happening when we were chatting last. I think probably a couple of updates internally politically that have happened since our last conversation. So Canada went back briefly to the House of Commons to pass sort of like a very tight legislative agenda. And one of the pieces of legislation federally that was brought forward by Carney's government is Bill C5, which is a piece of legislation that was actually had to be broken out into two pieces of legislation. We have a briefing note on Pocket Lobbyist about it, and I can send that to you after if you want. But essentially, this idea of making interprovincial trade barriers obsolete in Canada, which the federal government sort of attempted to do with the tools that they have, and this idea of getting a framework in place to have these big nation building projects go forward in Canada, the Building Canada Act, if you will. So I think politically, you've had the G7, you've had some legislation come forward with a acknowledgement that with these US tariffs, Canada does have to strengthen its internal economy and pull on the levers that it can. And then you had Calgary Stampede, which in Canada and Calgary for sure is a huge thing. And now we're sort of into the summer where people are not in Ottawa. I know there was a couple questions that came in on Instagram. There's people on vacation, but Trump is still very much moving forward in some of his tariff discussions and policies. And so there's that happening in the background as well. I would say politically, the Liberals have a pretty comfortable governing minority operating as a majority right now. I would say that the fear of going to an early election in the next 6 months is not very high. Pierre Poilievre is hoping to get a seat in the by-election that's happening in Battle River Crowfoot, which is actually happening on August 18th, so in a couple of weeks. He'll then have his House seat back for, hopefully, if he wins that. And then he'll be back in September, opposition with Carney as well. So I would say that's sort of a high-level overview of what's happening on Canadian economics. I think that on the tariff side of things, the important things for people to know is, obviously, since Trump came in, we've had a lot of back and forth on tariffs. The US imposes tariffs, we impose retaliatory tariffs. All of these tariff discussions have culminated basically to today on August 7th, after this July 31st, August 1st deadline that Trump had imposed, one of his many deadlines. Essentially, Canada right now is in a position where we face on non-USMCA or CUSMA items, which is only about 15% of the trade that we do between the United States and Canada. We face a 35% tariff. We face 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, up from 25% in early June. We continue to face automobile tariffs, but if you ask Canadians, this is obviously not a great situation. If you ask Americans, particularly American diplomats that have been carrying this message for the Trump administration, their argument is that Canada's effective tariff rate, so if you average it out, because not the goods that are included in USMCA are not included as part of this 35% number, they will tell you that the sort of effective tariff rate that Canada faces is lower than most other countries at about 5%. But interestingly enough, what they will also say is that they think that Canada is in a relatively good position compared to other countries, which you could argue they are. But they will also tell you that the only two countries that have responded to what President Trump is doing with retaliatory tariffs are Canada and China. And so I'm not sure that's necessarily the company we want to be keeping on that topic, but to be determined. I would say all of this is also happening, just another minute here of tariff and political summaries. I would say all of these tariff negotiations are happening, and we'll get into why I think they're happening in some of the politics, with a few sticky issues, irritants that people have been calling them. So the Trump administration takes particular issue, so they tell us, on some of what they believe are USMCA violations happening with Canada with respect to supply management, so dairy and poultry and eggs, which is a huge, huge issue in this discussion, or they say it's a huge issue. Softwood lumber as well, because the US believes that Canada subsidizes this industry by way of relatively low stumpage fees, and then some sort of irritants on wine and alcohol and some other goods as well. So I would say, just sort of overarching, that is where we are with tariffs. We also are in a situation where the USMCA is up for renegotiation in summer of 2026. So these conversations diplomatically are also starting to happen. So right now, Canada is lucky or relatively better off than other countries because we do have the USMCA, but that is up for renegotiation. So 85% of the goods that we're trading are exempt right now because the US has not touched those. But we don't know how secure or stable that agreement is going to be into the long term. So am I missing anything? I think that's probably the high level of what listeners probably want to know.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I think hilariously, the thing that people are seeing first and foremost has been the de minimis whole loophole closure.
Right.
Where folks are getting hit with duties on goods that they're importing or exporting into the United States or into Canada that in the past had been exempt are no longer. So effectively what it is, it's like for everything under the cost of $800, it used to be able to ship across border. And a number of e-commerce businesses actually would set up shop on the other side of the border, predominantly in Mexico, and they'd ship into the United States. And whether you be from China or from India or Europe, you'd set up your distribution in Mexico, ship into the United States, and you wouldn't have to pay tariffs. That hole is being closed, and that is an enormous impact on a industry that has been skirting those tariffs or traditional border tariffs and taxes. So that that I think is a under the radar miss. Market participants like me and portfolio managers know this because of companies like Shopify that run massive e-commerce stores for these businesses. And you can see it's been impacting the smaller business. But
Yeah.
I think you really hit on everything there. Now, I think the question is, what is going to happen next? We have coverage until summer of next year. Truthfully, like 15% of trade is impacted by these 35% tariffs, with the exception of energy. How exactly are we going to negotiate moving forward? Is this going to be such a headwind for our country that we deal with this prior to next year? And from what I can tell, based on the current projection from our federal government, it doesn't seem like they seem to care, or they're not taking it as seriously as perhaps we thought they might when we went to vote for the current party in power not longer than however many months ago, right? So on my end of the spectrum, we've gone from January 6th, inauguration day, Donald Trump gets in.
Not January 6th. That's a different date.
Oh yeah, you're right. Shoot. 21st, right?
Yes. Right.
Yeah,
It was
sorry.
a team, but January 6th is a different day.
But yeah, January 21st, he's inaugurated, and markets are up 3-4% heading into February. And then on August 2nd, and between the end of January, beginning of February through to April 2nd, we had a lot of conversation and threats regarding or revolving around tariffs. Liberation Day was the 2nd of April, and we see markets go from being up 3-5% to the NASDAQ actually at its trough was down 21. Fast forward to today, and the NASDAQ's up 10%. If you would have told me at the beginning of April that the tariff deal flow would be as substantial and work its way through markets and reprice so substantially to the upside as it has, I think most people would be shocked, and I would be too. The reality is that we've seen a 30+% change in the NASDAQ in a 90-day period, 120-day period, and that is shocking. Truly shocking. That is a faster move than we saw in COVID, which is an unbelievable change. And I think that what has obviously occurred, we had we'll call it March instance where we had Navarro, an advisor to Donald Trump, who seemed to rue the day. His view on tariffs were winning arguments with the president. And then I think that this is fairly true with regards to Donald Trump. He reacts to how the market reacts. He reacts to how poll numbers look based on ideas, because he will just throw something out there to see how it plays. And he did exactly that with his tariff numbers, where you saw numbers from 20% to 140%. He was tweeting out random increases on tariff goods with China without any response from them whatsoever. It was quite random and messy. But you come through to today, and he's announcing deals with countries that, when you listen to the debate with our federal leaders, with Pierre, Jagmeet, and Carney, they talked about how dire and how important this tariff situation was, and then they reiterated that there would be this response to the American tariff regime and retaliation from not just Canada but from the rest of the world that just hasn't occurred. If you look at what's actually resulted, you've seen a reduction in tariff goods and exports out of the United States into Japan, the EU, the UK, and China, and an increase on tariff goods into the United States with hardly any pushback from any of these countries. Not only that, you combine it with massive commitments in energy purchases to the tune of 250 billion, or to what is assumed to be close to 750 billion from the EU. You have deals coming out the yin yang. And the result of that is an S&P 500 that's up 8-9%. You have a NASDAQ up 10 from down 20. And if you were to sit here and say, whoever's in the White House is a lunatic, well, shoot, it's very, very hard to say that what he has done hasn't worked
for the United States. And I think you make a good point.
Now, we are Canadians, and we're sitting here wondering, oh man, did we make a mistake? Are we not taking advantage of our position? What are we supposed to do today to either continue to do business with the United States as our largest trading partner, and then also position ourselves so that we can take advantage of an economy in with regards to the United States that is on fire right now.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, so too is Canada's, to a certain extent.
Actually, more jobs added in Canada in July than in the United States based on their jobs numbers.
I think it flies in the face of what most people's concerns were heading into the election and then heading into the summer. And I mean, it speaks to just how important it is to stay invested. But then also, when you see volatility, when you see fear, when you have this crazy change in price, it's actually just a phenomenal opportunity. It almost always is, right? And the pessimists almost always lose money while the optimists make it. And
you and I are always on this bent of like, yes, let's look at the real impacts of what's going on. Let's be realistic about the pros and cons of what these policy decisions will have in the short or medium term. But I think like part of why we're friends and part of why I think, you in the work that you do and me in the work that I do, we have good relationships with the people that we work with, is because I think you cannot light your hair on fire or just think short term with these things, especially in markets, in politics for sure as well. You have to sort of see that horizon or at least participate in both markets and politics in a way where you do have hope for the future, because otherwise what do you have that is left? And markets are, markets don't have feelings, but they are influenced by people who have feelings. And I think that it's just always really important to keep that in mind. I feel like you've just said so many really important things. I don't even know where I want to start. I think the first point that I want to start on, I think, is it's interesting just in terms of how you're talking about the performance of markets and how the NASDAQ's done. I think it's really interesting because these tariffs obviously do play a part in markets, in speculating how companies are going to be doing, how that's going to affect the economy. But it's interesting because when we talk about tariffs in the context of Canada versus US, or thinking as Canadians how this is impacting our economy, that's definitely different than markets, because Canada is not moving the needle. Canadian companies themselves are not moving huge needles on for the markets writ large. Would that be fair to say? Like it's not Canadian-based companies that are making the biggest difference.
No, and interestingly, I feel like there is a certain stark difference between Canada and the United States. It's very important to point that out, actually. Mm-hmm. However, I mean, if you just look at stock index performance this year, the TSX has outperformed the S&P 500 by 2 or 3%. Fantastic. Over the last 15 years, we're way behind. This does matter, and I think it points to something directionally. You have the Canadian market that is predominantly banking and commodity export based, energy based. That is the lion's share of our economy. If you were to add a third, we'll call it the third leg to that stool, it is our housing market. Our housing market has lagged. Certainly, it has been a sore spot for most. However, the energy industry is doing terrifically. Our province, specifically Alberta, is doing very well. The reality is that Canada does well when commodity prices do well, and therefore things are looking fantastic. However, from an investment perspective and innovation perspective, a tech industry, we don't really have that, with the exception of a few companies like Constellation Software, Shopify, etc.
And I think it's also worth noting on the energy side of things, just because, I mean, obviously Canada's energy industry is amazing. Like we're both from Alberta. I live in Calgary, is where all of the big head offices are. Obviously, the Canadian jurisdiction is very important for that. But I also think it's important to note, and linking it back to markets, most of the companies that are headquartered here in Calgary that are in that commodity space do have either existing operations or opportunity to operate elsewhere in the world. And I think that there's an aspect of those companies might be doing well, but I think there's that corresponding public policy from Canada's perspective that has to be willing to invite that investment and make it economical for those companies to want to continue investing in Canada. And that's how that's sort of like the point that I was trying to get across in terms of like, you can the stock market be going gangbusters, and you can still be thinking, okay, well, is that going to translate into the Canadian economy? And I think that it does, obviously, but I think there's policy that has to follow to make sure that we can realize that upside. I think it's also really interesting you mentioned just about voting and during the federal election, are we regretting, or are Canadians regretting taking the approach that they did in electing a liberal minority government? I think it's really interesting because right now, and as you mentioned, we are going to have a renegotiation of CUSMA next year, and Canada is, relatively speaking, largely protected from some of these major tariffs through CUSMA, USMCA currently. It's interesting because the elections are about the economy, obviously, and we had this tariff war and people didn't know what was going to happen with Trump. And so it is interesting because during the campaign, it's actually politically expedient for politicians. And I'm not even just saying that the Liberals just did this, the Conservatives and the NDP did this as well. It's actually in their best interest to manufacture or exacerbate or hyperbolize the economic risk during an election, because they're trying to say we have this huge problem and we have this huge risk, and here's why we're the people to deal with it. And I think Mark Carney was particularly successful when it came to his elbows up approach, particularly with boomers, but not just boomers. And so I think you had this sort of political need to maybe no, I don't want to say misrepresent the economics, because that's not entirely true, but perhaps to cause people to be fearful, because fearful is a very motivating factor in politics, about what this was going to mean for Canada's economy. So I think it's very interesting as well. There was definitely political benefit into making that economic worry and that financial worry perhaps bigger than it currently is. Not to say that if this doesn't get resolved that it's not going to be bad for Canada, but there's that aspect as well. So that is really just something interesting that you touched on as well. And I think that all of this is sort of happening as well in the context of, you mentioned other countries that are willing to make investments into the United States and are sort of playing Trump's game, if you will, if we are to say what Trump's doing is a game. I think it's very interesting strategically where Canada is coming from, because Canada, through this elbows up mandate and approach, has decided that they're not going to fully play into that idea at this juncture. They're going to be elbows up. They're going to keep those retaliatory tariffs on, even though Carney, we've seen in the news that maybe he's going to back off on some of those. We've seen the comments that are coming from our government officials about Trump and his administration, which, regardless of what you think about that, the administration is hearing those things. You're also seeing people make the US-Canada trade argument a little bit more personal by not traveling to the United States anymore. So it's very interesting to see the juxtaposition between other countries who are responding to Trump's actions by actually understanding the leverage that they do or do not have in this situation and playing into it a little bit more, where Canada seems to be a little bit more elbows up, if you will. Does that resonate with you at all, or does that feel like accurate at all?
I think it does for sure. It has, and I believe that, interestingly, it has worked out fine. The way that I view kind of the next 12 to 14, 16 months is an opportunity to position ourselves appropriately. And I felt like that was the originating opportunity, not 4 or 5 months ago, or call it 6, 7 months ago, back in March, April, when we had that election. We had this major push to unite as a country. As you'd mentioned in your earlier remarks, kind of laying the land where we had Bill C-8. You would assume that would then entice other provinces to reduce trade barriers between one another. But I just read an RBC report that stated the increase in trade amongst provinces, and it just has not resulted in anything, actually. Shockingly, we've just continued to trade more with the United States. And it's kind of behooving to me. I just cannot figure out why there has been no movement here. You see a political administration south that seemingly can get so much done in so little time. And don't get me wrong, it's almost as though it's run by a mob boss to an extent, where he's doing things that are so irregular and you can't really make sense of it. But it seems from a newswire perspective, things are actually happening. Things are changing. I mean, I find that we're still stuck in the mud, and it's disappointing. And I believe that Albertans specifically, and I think anybody who is truly in an entrepreneur or a business leader, they are still very, very concerned and upset that, okay, sure, the market's up a little bit this year, but like, what is going on with regards to our trade deals? What is going on interprovincially? I don't think we're that worried, from an Alberta perspective, about the importance of our trade and trade position with the United States, because energy is something that they do not have enough of, cannot replace, and hilariously are growing. Their demand for that, the amount of consumption with regards to gas, electricity, energy in general, is skyrocketing in the US. Our position from an Alberta perspective has never been better. I don't think we're scared at all. However, the rest of the provinces should be. We aren't getting anything done. We're not lowering our barriers between one another and coming together to negotiate with the United States or to position ourselves to perhaps trade with each other rather than with other countries. So I guess me sitting here, I'm asking, what are the barriers there? Who has to come together to get this done? Is it happening? Or is it just because it's summer and no one likes to work that we're going to wait until October, November?
So I think, okay, so I would say that C5 addressed C5 is federal legislation, and Canada lives in a federal system. So there's constitutional limits on what the federal government can tell the provinces to do. So C5, pardon me, really attempted to touch on the things that the federal government has control over or feels they have control over with respect to nation building infrastructure projects, for example. And so there's a federal role for this for sure. There's a provincial role for these things as well, because provinces need to look at their own legislation and sort of harmonize. There were some things that were removed, about 53 exemptions, I think, under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. But interprovincial trade barriers can be anything from tire size, moving from British Columbia to Alberta, to whether or not, a nurse is recognized in Ontario and Saskatchewan, right? So these things are vast because provinces do have a lot of responsibility within their own jurisdictions. I guess I would say that many provinces, and let's just even take Alberta, for example, many provinces are looking at two different audiences here, right? So they're looking at, okay, you're right. Alberta has this amazing opportunity with respect to US demand for energy and definitely wants to take advantage of that and capitalize on that. But Alberta also has issues with existing federal legislation that they believe are going to really impact the energy industry and are going to make it more difficult for growth. And so you see provinces coming together and to a certain extent saying, yes, rah, rah, Canada, but you also see provinces not wanting to go all the way in an effort to remove all of those sort of grievances in service of the US-Canada situation, because provinces still have their own issues with the federal government. And I think if you abandon all of those grievances, I'm just speaking for Alberta right now, but I mean, look at Quebec on supply management, or, Ontario on auto. If you just say in service for the broader good of Canada, we're just going to stop asking for any of the things that we feel the federal government is doing that are getting in the way. It would be good for Canada probably, but I think maybe only in the short term, because provinces are thinking more long-term about their economy. So I would say that it's a good, C5 was definitely a good start. We're going to have to see on some of these nation building projects how quickly they're able to expedite them, as they say they have been. We have a lot of criticism from Indigenous groups on this happening, and it is a lot of control within the federal government to decide which projects are going to qualify as nation building projects, right? And so I think there's some of that as well. So provinces, I think, are going to keep some cards close to their chest on this, because they understand the principle of leverage, because that's the negotiating nature of provinces within Canada. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I would say that this is something we have to watch over the next 12 to 18 months. I know Carney said in his campaigning, removing all of these restrictions by July 1st, like that was never going to be possible on the grand scale. He's done, I think, what he can federally, and we could give him a check mark for that to a certain extent. But I think it's just the issue is so much deeper and more complex than the federal government just waving a wand and saying, now have no barriers between each other.
Okay, fair enough. So, okay, I'm sitting in the shoes as a private citizen in Alberta. Let's say you're an entrepreneur. What's the headwind to growth in the province of Alberta right now from a political perspective?
I would say that the key issues that are brought up time and time again are C-69 with respect to the Revised Impact Assessment Act, and how that has been an ongoing issue for the past 8 to 10 years for sure. On how much certainty a proponent in building a project has when they make investment decisions, because of the uncertainty and time and resources that go into that regulatory approval process. So that's a big one for Alberta. I would say another big one for Alberta is C-48, which is, again, you've probably heard this a long time. They're referred to respectively, C-69 is referred to as the No More Pipelines Bill. And C-48, it has to do with tanker bans off the West Coast. I would say those are two big ones. I would say another one that's just not talked about quite as much, but is actually a huge deal, is federal net zero electricity grid regulations by the federal government by 2035. The provinces are very much not in agreement on the timelines of these things. So. Yeah. So those are, I would say, the main sticking points for Alberta energy, but you do have certain issues that crop up on across other areas as well. I would say that just generally speaking, to taxation, immigration, crime, all becoming, some of these social issues all becoming increasingly more important when we think of just social cohesion and safety of cities and wanting people to want to live in Canada. I think immigrants and people who were born here alike. So I think those are other things that that the provinces and Alberta in particular are focused on.
So 35 minutes almost, and we didn't talk about housing once. I don't know how that's possible.
I know. Well, I mean, can I just say one thing about housing, and then you can jump in? I think housing is a symptom of the broader problems. And every single time you and I speak, we talk about this. Housing makes up such a disproportionately large portion of Canada's GDP, and it's not productive value in our economy. And so regulatory issues, and this isn't even limited to energy, there's regulatory issues that happen tech companies and all these different things that sort of restrict growth. It is a combination of pro-growth policies and also looking to what the United States is doing, because Canada, not only now are companies going to look at where it's profitable to do business, they're going to look at where the biggest upside for them to be operating is. And so what you don't want is for it to be 1,000 times easier to do business in the United States on a pipeline project, for example, than it is in Canada, because that's where the capital will go. And so I would just say that the housing aspect is an immigration issue in terms of supply, absolutely. Interprovincial immigration plus immigration from other parts of the country. It is a local issue in terms of building permits and red tape and all of these types of things. But it is, I think, it's a symptom of the fact that we are not shooting for the moon when it comes to our economic goals, and good enough has been good enough because it's benefited an entire generation that is very active, that doesn't actually feel the pain of some of these policies. So sorry, I cut you off, but that's housing on my end.
No, I tend to fall in line with most of what you're suggesting. And I mean, I know for even my local area where I live, the density is becoming more of an issue. It's interesting to watch as it progresses. And I think if you were to then expand that to all the other cities throughout the country, it would actually be significantly hotter of a topic. So I'm starting to learn a little bit more about that municipality or the municipal pain, but from a more broad market opportunity perspective, I see like the three issues that you brought up: no more pipelines, the offshore shipping and exporting, and then the electricity grid as being probably the number one current headwind, but then removal and it being a tailwind to opportunity in Canada specifically. And and more kind of from a drill down perspective, Alberta, the reality of the current global economy is that it hinges on the results of 7, 8, maybe 10 companies right now, and the capex that they project. If you start to look at how the market rebounded so viciously and quickly, it was the rolling over of and the easing of tariff expectations, but probably more importantly, it was the performance and the capital expenditure programs of Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, and the receipts coming through with NVIDIA. And these companies are investing 100 to 160 billion per year. Like, that's the budget of a country. And they're doing this at such a pace and growing that capex at such a pace that it's blowing the minds of people, but also it's floating this economy. But what this signals is that if these companies truthfully see a return of capital and a return on investment to these capex numbers, the demand for energy is going to blow everyone's minds. Like, my understanding of the current consumption of energy in the United States, it's like somewhere between 765 and 785 gigawatts of energy consumption. That consumption number, let's go with 785, has been growing between 1% and 2% for multiple decades. We have seen very little growth in energy consumption. That has been paraded and championed by many people that view energy or carbon as being a detriment to the environment. I agree with all of those things. However, it is also tied and linked directly to productivity. Canada has had a long time issue with productivity. We have lagged the United States quite significantly, but the United States is now projecting that they're going to see between 8 and 12% energy consumption increases annualized through 2035.
Yeah.
That is unbelievable. So to think that the global consumption of energy is going to stay flat or decline, people have no idea what's coming. The electricity grid that needs to be carbon neutral by 2035, not a hope. You can't stand up a nuclear reactor in less than 8 years, basically, maybe 5 if you're Elon Musk. You can't stand up a gas plant in less than 2. So if we don't start investing in these areas, there is going to be such an incredible increase in the cost of energy that most people are going to freak.
Which,
I'd
by
be
the way,
Right.
plagues like that is a concern of global South countries, stereotypically, not of developed nations. And I think that you raised just a really interesting point that connects some of what we're talking about. And then we should probably get into some of the questions, because we actually did get a lot of questions from people, which is always super fun. With all that's happening in the United States and Canada and globally, I think that I was listening to a podcast this morning, just like doing some reading, and this idea that Donald Trump is a revolutionary figure using authoritarian means, perhaps in some arenas and theaters with what he's doing. I don't think this is just a thing that's happening in the United States. Like we can have a whole separate podcast on how AI and just social issues, political issues, the way that we're sort of seeing increased conflicts and geopolitical issues across the world. I think that we are entering into a new sort of phase of reality that most of us have not actually ever experienced. And I think that I don't want to go so far as just, yeah, it's a paradigm shift. And I think that so many of the things that small L progressivism as a result of small L liberalism, constant pursuit of technological advances, globalization, interconnectedness, all of these things that were for so long such a good, generally, force. The rules of the game are changing. And I think that as we navigate these coming days, weeks, months, years, I think it's going to be really important to be mindful of how previous playbooks over the last 20 to 30 years, socially, economically, politically, are not going to be instructive for us for the next 20 to 30 years. And I think that you don't have to like what Trump's doing, but Trump is the leader of the largest economy on the earth. Canada depends immensely on the United States. So you can either accept that this is the reality that you have to deal with and try to find success within this new paradigm, or you can fight it. And if you want to fight it, fine. And certain parts of it probably do deserve to be fought. But on just a purely economic lens, we're not in 2008 anymore. We're not in 1998 anymore. Like, this is a very different time. So I think we need to look forward with that in mind. So yes, climate change and decarbonization is extremely important, but it's not going to happen with a decrease in demand in energy like we thought, 5-10 years ago.
We fought for it for 10 years. Like,
yeah,
our country debated it politically for a decade, maybe 2. The fact of the matter is that is no longer even possible. I don't think folks quite grasp it yet. I don't think it's being reported on sufficiently. The truth is that we have 2 different paradigm changes, I think. One, politically, in how people act, the way in which support in terms of new progressive technology has changed. I think that has been Donald Trump has ushered in a paradigm change, and especially on small c conservatism and large C. I mean, shoot, the thing that he's signing today with regards to banking and with crypto and religious entities, it's shocking how fast he moves and the things that he does. I think that has changed. That is a paradigm shift politically, but then also technologically, we are now experiencing the power of something likely as important as the internet was. And the efficiency and productivity gains from those things were immense. The returns on capital were incredible. The opportunity was unbelievable. I'm super excited for it, but I'm also, I think, I'm very concerned for how ready people are. And I don't think that they are even close. And people are not well versed enough in this, and it needs to be discussed in more detail, because it's coming for everyone, and also it's going to move so fast and ripple through society and the globe so quickly that we need to be prepared. And I'm hopeful that our current federal government, our current provincial governments can understand, I think, how big this moment is. The chat GPT moment was so darn big that if people don't start to understand how what the ripple through effects are going to be, and where the puck is going, and we're going to fall behind. And I think it's just so interesting that we have such a tremendous opportunity as Canadians to be north of the greatest economy on the world, and to not perhaps position ourselves to take best advantage of it. And I'm hopeful that we can. I think you laid out some really great things that need to be addressed. So I'm very optimistic, because I'm just that type of person, but it does concern me, because I'd love to just go maybe in another podcast, talk about the challenges that are facing my generation, the younger generation, whether it be finding careers, etc., how to utilize these things. Holy smokes. So let's finish there with regards to markets, etc. I'd love to address a few of the questions. If you want to start off with one that you received, that'd be awesome.
Okay, so we had a question come in that asked how tariffs are going to impact startups and tech companies in Canada and the US. That was sent in on Facebook. So I would say we've touched on a few of the themes here. I'll take a stab at this and then jump in, Joel. I would say that the challenge for governments is really going to be multifold. The first is going to be recognizing the regulatory challenges and response that's incumbent upon the government. So not over-regulating, but also not under-regulating in these areas, and having people who genuinely understand how these things work. You see that there are people in the Trump administration, for example, and I'm not trying to say that the Trump administration is doing everything right, but you see there are subject matter experts that are, billionaire successful. Not that billionaires should be successful. I'm going to get hate for that, but just people who have proven that they understand these things in the private markets and are now giving back through public service. And so I think we need more of that in Canada, and we need to incentivize people to want to do that. So I think there's that. I think that Canada needs to make sure that it doesn't punish people for doing well while still making sure that we have strong public services. So Carney's already said he's going to reverse the capital gains inclusion issues, like just not taxing to disincentivize growth in those areas. And then I think too, just being very deliberate and specific on where you're funding and getting involved in industry as a government. Like I would say that the place for government to get involved is at the universities and in research, and making sure that we have really strong institutions and can attract talent, and making sure that there is capital available in the private sphere for these things. You and I are always talking about this. This isn't new either. And then also just making sure that we're creating those pathways for skilled talent and immigration in the same way that we have for refugees and other people trying to come to Canada as well. I think there's a balance there. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but.
The one thing that I would say is that in the United States, it's very clear that Donald Trump is picking winners. Small caps, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, private businesses are really struggling in the face of these tariffs and the change in expectations. They're struggling to justify capex. It's hard to find your way when you're importing 30-40% of your goods from India or from China into your plants, for lack of a better word, and not knowing the cost of those goods as they come in, and then having to then compete with price with very, very large companies that are $1 trillion in value. I think that sadly, this has been an exercise in king making, in the creation of American oligarchs to an extent. I think that has occurred in the US. Now in Canada, more broadly, I think that it's obviously been less of an issue. We don't have that threat to the rest of the world where we're going to shut down our trade, our economy to others. The push for a developed America in terms of they're going to reshore manufacturing, I think is a really, really cool and interesting opportunity for Canadians. We have incredible educated engineering group. We have amazing manufacturing jobs. I think it's quite hilarious to think that there is going to be this massive manufacturing shift to the US when we just do it so darn well here. We have terrific access to commodities. It is a really great opportunity. Now, I also think the same thing for Mexico. I have this thesis that the reshoring of American manufacturing is actually going to be more so nearshoring. This belief that they're going to do it all internally or back at home, and they're going to start making iPhones, and they're going to start doing more manufacturing at home. It's just not true. It's truthfully going to be a nearshoring event, bringing that manufacturing that'll shore up from a military perspective, the risk from a supply chain perspective. Certainly TSMC building 3-4 nanometer capacity in Arizona and in Texas is a really great and incredible accomplishment. But the reality is that I think North America is going to become more cohesive in the face of these tariffs, even though we have no resolution so far this year. That is my prediction over the next 10. So how do tariffs, how is this going to affect business, small business? In the short term, I think it's going to be really harsh. I think it's going to be, in Canada, much less impactful than perhaps some people feel it's going to be. However, that does not include e-commerce. For that, I'm slightly more concerned. I see it as being a difficult place to compete outside of design and marketing. I feel as though manufacturing, et cetera, it's going to be very, very challenging to do it here locally. So, I mean, that's my take on that question.
Okay, all good thoughts. We have maybe 4 or 5 questions, so we'll try and we can maybe go a couple minutes over. But yeah. Okay, so the next question that came in was talking about interest rates, and so asking whether or not the Bank of Canada is going to hold at 2.75% on the next rate update on September 17th. I think that, I would defer to your sort of perspective on the markets, but I think that the Canada and US are facing different forces here in evaluating whether to keep their overnight rate or their interest rates consistent. Canada's is lower than in the United States, and there's good reason for that. But I think people are thinking in Canada, at least, I don't know what you're hearing, that there is probably going to just be a hold at 2.75 in September. Because of all the uncertainty that's happening with tariffs. But I do know that some people are thinking there may be a cut in the US. So I don't know if you want to comment on what that is.
Well, I want to make it very clear. Canada and the United States has the exact same mandate: full employment and stability of price. They want to keep inflation between a target of 2 and 2.5 to 3%. Currently, the United States is sub 3%, but it's going up. If you refer to their most recent jobs data, the Canadian jobs data was stronger than the United States. And I think that there's now going to be a slight shift here. The US is priced in already 2 cuts. I think it's been quite clear to anybody who has been watching the news that Donald Trump is unhappy with the current Fed chair. He's not actually...
Wait, I gotta pause. Did you watch, I think I reposted it. Did you watch that construction video where they're at the new Federal Reserve? Honestly, that was just so gold, because I just loved. Honestly, it was so funny. I know the reality of it is a little whoa, but you got to just laugh sometimes at those things. Man. So if you have not watched it, you got to go watch the meme of Powell and Trump in hard hats
and
debating.
For some extra context, Jerome Powell is one of the greatest private equity operators to ever live, and you have this guy who's he's 6'4", and he's throwing numbers out about the cost of construction it's real. And then Jerome Powell's just looking at this piece of paper being like, no, that's wrong. You're adding buildings. Anyways, the the situation is silly. And so he's trying to find reasons to fire him for cause. The cause being that his budget on the Fed buildings that they're renovating is going to be just for him to be fired, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Fact
So
of the matter
anyway,
is,
I love
Brent
that.
told him,
Yeah.
don't fire him. He's gone come beginning of next year. Just start to roll out your choice for the next Fed chair. And it's likely that it could be Hackett or a smattering of two other folks that are currently in the 8 that make up the board. But Canada, again, as you mentioned, has cut faster and more aggressively than the United States has since the 2022-2023 tightening event. I don't foresee Canada cutting. It's very possible that we don't cut for the rest of this year. Our economy is doing fine. Our employment could be better, but it's full. And I think that there's not a justifiable reason to cut at the moment, given where our currency is, where employment is. That, again, subject to change come November. It's silly to make a prediction any further than a month or 2 months out with regards to rate cuts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we had another couple of questions about interprovincial trade, which I think we've sort of answered, just talking about why some of these interprovincial trade barriers are still in existence. So I think we did touch on that. There's a difference sort of between on what the federal government levers are and what the provincial government levers are. I don't want to like hate on Carney in these next couple of questions, because I guess some of these were like comments or
statements more so than
statements than questions. But there was a question that I think is kind of interesting to talk about, just because we are talking about markets, of just questions of the conflict of interest sort of perception, or real or otherwise, with Carney. And I actually do want to spend a few minutes talking about this, because I'm of sort of two minds. So the question was really just about why we don't care more about Carney's conflict of interest. So I want to outline this just so that everybody sort of knows what the rules are for this in Canada, and then we can sort of like discuss on the politics and the sentiment of it. So I do want to just make clear, so provincially and federally, every elected official does have to submit to conflict of interest requirements. These are reviewed annually by ethics commissioners provincially and federally. And there's, I think, an almost universal across provinces, and certainly federally, a requirement to put your assets into a blind trust when you are in elected office. And this is true for elected officials in many jurisdictions across Canada. It is also true for staffers and senior bureaucrats. And so I would say that the intentions of the current legislation and framework that we have around this are strong. Like there's not, Carney isn't like making trades behind the Prime Minister's desk at this point. Like his stuff is in a blind trust. So I just want to say that I think that the question that I think people raise sometimes that is worth discussing is just whether a blind trust is enough for somebody who is of such significant, or we think such significant means, and has so much sort of private sector experience. I think, even though Carney's not controlling what the trades are, he still does know what was in his portfolio when he put it into a blind trust, and maybe it's changed. And maybe it changes, whatnot. But I think we have to be careful with this rhetoric, because I think that when we focus in, I mean, yes, we do have to be conscious of how conflicts of interest can impact any individual. And I'm saying this is more of a conservative as well. So just full sort of disclosure on that. I think we need to not demonize people for having been successful and then going into public office. There do need to be guardrails, but I just think that Carney gets a lot of heat. I think Carney is a talented politician in many ways, and he's obviously accomplished a lot in his private life. And I just think that we should not necessarily demonize people for having been successful. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I have no issue
with our politicians having been successful in their careers. And if anything, I'm more interested in a politician who has operated in the private market and been successful and has has an understanding of what the average person tends to go through, or even what a business owner might go through, I find that is something that's a good thing. Now, my main concern with his holdings is that it's predominantly American.
Right. And I think that's worth
It's
discussing.
ugly.
Yeah.
So from my point of view, it's like, okay, our our prime minister, who we voted in to have his elbows up, is fighting with a country that he has like 97 odd % of his portfolio invested in. That to me is a concern. Why is he not betting on Canada?
And it's a concern, I think, for me, because it's just there's a lack of congruence between the message and the reality. And I think that, we've kind of come full circle in our discussion here, but I think this is something that everybody needs to really pay attention to in politics now and moving forward. This is not even just something that happens along partisan lines. Like, I think this is something that happens in every political party. Don't allow politicians to prey on your fears and anxieties to drive the way that you vote. I think that we need to be governing a little bit more on values, from economic values and social cohesion values and all of these things, than we are on vibes. I do think that we're making a shift in our society on that, but I do think that there are market and behavioral rules that are consequences of policy decisions. And I think that we would do well to not pretend like those forces don't exist. And I think we can, if we're just a little bit more realistic and honest about the consequences of policy actions and the push-pull and the trade-offs that are inherent in politics, where there's never really perfect solutions, but what you're trying to do is just move more in the direction of a society that can be prosperous and where everybody has this opportunity to accomplish their good life, whatever that version is. I do think we just need to be a little bit more cognizant of that, and cognizant of like the conflict of interest that politicians are in when they use fear to motivate you and what you vote for. I don't know if that made any sense, but I just think it's like more important now than ever to be getting our news from primary sources and having that like higher level of political and economic acumen, because I think most people mean well, but they don't have the capacity or time or ability to fully understand some of these things. And so I'm really happy to have these discussions with you, obviously, because that's what we're trying to do, is make that more accessible. But I think this can become more and more important, especially in this paradigm shift.
Yeah. And truthfully, I think this would probably take another hour. I find that what those high levels of quality news and opinion is changing very quickly. And what traditional media used to be is no longer, and the incumbent media sources is now this sort of medium versus what our parents grew up consuming, right? And how they went about voting and why. So I think that what you said is important. Obviously, in my prime minister, I want him to be betting on Canada, because he's incentivized to do.
And if he's not, we have to ask why a smart person isn't. And now that you're in that prime minister's chair, you have to think about not necessarily what the electorate wants to hear or the realities that win you votes, but the market realities that caused you to make those decisions in the past, and how we can have more decisions that are happening that would maybe make you want to make different decisions in the future.
I completely agree. So I think we touched on a large number of the questions. I think attacked most things. I think it's successful live stream, Mel. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, we could live stream for like 4 or 5 hours, but that's not feasible for either of us. So
no, not really.
Nope. Got to go pick up the kiddos and explain tariffs to them.
Yes, exactly. Come on, Simon. Come here. Sit down.
All right, cool. Well, where can people find you if they want to like follow you along with what you're doing with Reformed Millennials and all that kind of stuff?
Come check me on, honestly, where am I posting these days? LinkedIn, Joel Shackleton. If not there, I am fairly active on Twitter, but it's not because I'm posting, it's because I'm consuming. So at Joel Shackleton. is where you'll find me everywhere else on the internet.
Awesome. And you can follow us at Pocket Lobbyist for any of the other information that we're discussing. So, okay. Thanks, Joel. We'll do this again soon. Take care. Stay golden. Bye.